I was a bit stunned and then grateful when Dan Fagin, who won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction for his book Tom's River, A Story of Science and Salvation, agreed to let me interview him. It is a story of how a corporation in the 1950s contaminated the water in a flourishing town in New Jersey. It's also an uplifting tale of how the citizens and scientists came together to take that corporation to court and hold it accountable. Dan talks about the importance of citizens getting informed and then speaking out, and I could not agree with him more. Bon appetit.
Well, I had been covering the issues that I explore in this book for a very long time, including right here on Long Island, where I live. I was a reporter for Newsday for many years, and it was clear to me that many people on Long Island, as in many other parts of the country, were really concerned about the link between their environment and their health, especially chronic diseases like cancer. And so I wrote a lot about those issues for Newsday, but I never really felt like I was cutting to the core, really getting to the heart of what these issues are all about, why they're important, and how they really play out. So when I heard about what had happened in Tom's River, I actually went down and covered that when I was a reporter for Newsday here in New York. That really intrigued me. And I always said, you know, that would be a good book someday. So when I moved to full-time academia, I immediately thought of Tom's River as the perfect kind of story for me, which is, you know, an amazing story in its own right, a compelling narrative, but also one that stood for something much bigger and much more important. Tom's River is an ordinary town in many ways. For most of the events described in the book, it had maybe 60, 70,000 people. So it wasn't tiny, but it certainly wasn't large either. What made Tom's River different is that the chemical industry came to town, starting in 1952. A very large factory opened and almost immediately became the largest employer in the whole county. And it became an engine of very rapid growth in Ocean County, New Jersey, which for a time was one of the fastest growing counties in the entire United States. And they just did not know how to handle that growth in many ways. And from the very start, there were indications that the environment in Tom's River was being damaged in potentially very significant ways. The water smelled, the river looked funny, there was lots of obvious air pollution, and yet the town folk and the corporations who were operating the plant both, they had a kind of an informal pact of silence where, you know, nobody asked any questions and everybody enjoyed the benefits of this rapid growth. The other big thing that happened is that illegal dumpers came to town, specifically one particularly horrendous incident in the back of an old chicken farm. And eventually both the factory that I described and the illegal dump site would both become Superfund sites and both contribute tragically to the health of the people of Tom's River. Well, for a long time, the employees of the plant thought that a number of people, too many people, were getting cancer and other chronic diseases. The company repeatedly told them, don't worry about it, we're on top of it. But those concerns lingered for a long time. The chemical plant was a very dangerous place where they handled some highly toxic compounds. It was the kind of a place where secretaries would go to work and sometimes the nylons, if they would walk onto the factory floor, their nylons would melt off of their legs. I mean, there were a lot of very volatile, highly toxic compounds. When things really began to change, though, is when citizens, lay people from the town started to sort of look around and say, gee, there seems to be a lot of childhood cancer in this community. And there was one person in particular, her name's Linda Gillick. She was a the kind of person who was just very outgoing, absolutely very community-minded, and she was also the kind of person that was not a passive person. You know, when she saw something that she didn't think was right, she got into it. You know, she asked questions, and she was also an amazing networker. Her son, Michael, was diagnosed with neuroblastoma, which at the time was a truly awful diagnosis, when Michael was just 3 months old. And they told Linda and her husband Rusty that Michael had a less than 50-50 chance of making it to his first birthday. The Gillicks were so traumatized that they decided to buy a coffin for Michael immediately, so that when the time came, as they thought inevitably would, they wouldn't have to make that horrible purchase. But Michael beat the odds. He's still alive today. He's had an incredibly difficult life, repeated surgeries, chemotherapy, radiation therapy, all kinds of health problems, but he's alive. He's in his 30s now. And he and his mom together formed a real network of parents and children, parents of children with cancer and children with cancer. And the story of Tom's River is the story of how they pushed for answers to what was really happening in their community. All kinds of obstacles. You know, they were really rocking the boat. You know, they thought that there really was a cluster of childhood cancer in their community, and the experts told them, no, it's a coincidence. Everyone always thinks there are clusters, and there are never clusters. And then eventually, when the research was done to show that it was indeed a cluster, they kept pushing, and they said, well, we want to know why there's a cluster. And the experts again told them, well, sorry, you'll never be able to figure that out. But they persevered, they pushed, and eventually the science was done that confirmed that not only was there a cluster, but that cluster was statistically associated with air pollution from the plant and water pollution from a well field that was contaminated by the illegal dump site. The story of how they got there is a story of how the parents eventually got those answers, is a story of incredible perseverance. They had to overcome the skepticism of the companies, of their governments, state and local government, which for years, decades, really had downplayed the issues. They also had to overcome the worries, the anxieties of their own neighbors, their fellow residents, who were really worried about their property values, what would this mean for the town's reputation, and they were certainly worried about all the jobs that were associated with the chemical plant, which for a time was by far the largest employer in Ocean County, New Jersey. So they had to overcome a lot, and it's really quite a dramatic story of how they managed to do that. Sure. Yeah, there definitely were. There were some very dedicated scientists, independent scientists, and eventually scientists who worked for state agencies, who really, after a lot of initial skepticism, really went above and beyond the minimum to try to find out what was really happening. And you know, the other element of Tom's River is that, yes, it's a very human story, but it's also a story of how the scientific method plays out. And personally, I find that really fascinating. It's an amazing detective story, and they crack the case eventually, but they would never have cracked the case had not sort of the combination of the energy from the local people and the expertise from the outside people coming in, if that had not sort of come together in an amazing synergy. But it took a long time, and you know, the real reason I wrote this book was because, you know, epidemiology is the science of patterns of disease, and epidemiology is really pretty good tool for figuring out what went wrong. It's not such a great tool for prevention. You know, the story of Tom's River is a little bit like the fire marshal coming in after the house is burned down and figuring out, okay, what really caused the fire. when of course what we really want to do is prevent the house from burning down in the first place. And that's the real reason I wrote this book, because I want people to learn. I want people to learn from the Toms River experience, and that's what the people of Toms River want too, more than anything else. Well, Toms River is absolutely a healthier place than it was during the time of the events that I describe in this book. The air is cleaner. The water is absolutely cleaner and much more tightly monitored. In fact, one of the big messages I hope I want to emphasize is that there's no reason to think that, you know, Toms River is an unsafe place to live. The whole point of my writing this book is not that I think that Toms River is some kind of an aberration. It's that I think it's not. It's that this is a universal story, and while Toms River at times may have been a more extreme case, these same issues are popping up all over the world. So I think that people of Toms River, you know, not everyone was excited about this book. Again, the old worries about property values and the reputation of the community. And it was also such an incredibly emotional thing for the people of Toms River to go through that a lot of people really wanted to move on. On the other hand, many people in town recognize that what they went through was horrible as it was, as perpetually tragic as it always will be, considering the children who died. It is also a teachable moment. It's a cautionary tale, an example that we all can learn from. And so I think that many of them now see the book as a good thing, as something that will help other people from making the same mistakes that they made. What happened in Toms River, I think, beautifully illustrates a classic conundrum in a free society, which is the clash between short-term and long-term thinking. That, you know, capitalism is capable of generating tremendous wealth, and yes, there are incredible income disparities, but it's also, at least at times, has been a decent generator of income for the middle class. On the other hand, capitalism is really obsessed with short-term benefits. It's not good at all in figuring out how to sort of strike the balance between short-term gain and long-term sustainability. And you know, that's why environmental issues are so incredibly difficult, because they're usually about some short-term sacrifice reducing, you know, the immediate benefit for a long-term payout, you know, for a long-term gain. And that's really the story of what happened in Toms River. There was too much short-term thinking, and it really took the children of Toms River so many of them getting sick, for residents of Toms River to sort of wake up and say, hey, we need to stop thinking only about our property values. We need to start thinking about the health of our children and their children. And once that started happening, Toms River became a much safer place. I think it's both a cautionary tale and it's an example of what can go wrong, but it's also an example of what can go right when citizens step up to the obligations of democracy and become fully engaged. There are different ways of being engaged. We know this. Personally, I like it when residents sort of, they not only show up in a meeting and speak out, but they also take the time to educate themselves about the complexities of the issues, which are often not as black and white as we initially think that they are. One thing's for sure, and that is that when the people of Toms River became fully engaged in what was happening in their community, things got better. And so that is a wonderful lesson for all of us.